Hello everybody and welcome to Charts with Dan, and I'm just basking in the afterglow of this weekend because, there's some weeks where if it's an off week or if a movie doesn't do well, I'm sitting here trying to figure out, well, what am I going to make the show about? This is the kind of week that a charts guy like myself dreams of because we knew that we were going to have the Barbie, Oppenheimer, Barbenheimer combination, and that was likely to set some records, but there were so many different kinds of records that were set this weekend and weird records that, required me to do a digging and looking into obscure numbers. In other words, I had a really great last couple days because this is the kind of stuff that I love. So we're going to talk about Barbie and we're going to talk about Oppenheimer, and we're going to talk about the two of them together, and even some of the movies that did not benefit from this unexpectedly massive combination of these two films. I mean, they really did dominate this weekend. So much to talk about. So let's jump right into it. These are the top 10 movies for this past weekend. And this is another one of those things when I say you can't track enthusiasm, because every single time new numbers came in for Barbie, they just got higher and higher, including the estimates yesterday. It went up in the actual numbers. The final figure on Barbie's opening was $162,022,044, the biggest opening of 2023, and a slew of other things that, of course, we are going to talk about in depth. In second place, look at this number. Oppenheimer debuting with $82.4 million. Its estimate kept on going up all weekend long. $82,455,420. So there were obviously a lot of people that did that double feature this weekend, but also some people that might have seen one or the other. And I'm going to get into the counter-programming angle on Barbie and Oppenheimer. But let's just take a moment, first of all, just to appreciate that 1 and 2. It is an historic pairing of films. We're going to look at the actual numbers. But in the environment that we're in, a movie opening to $162 million, another one opening to $82 million, when you look at the summer that we've had, I really hope for everybody, and sometimes even I have thought, well, do people just not like going to the movies anymore? This week proves that yes, if you can properly motivate people to go to the movies, they will still go to the movies. They'll get excited about it. They'll dress up for it. They'll bring their friends. And it looks like it's still happening going into this week. And neither of these movies had ruinous budgets. We're going to look at that information as well. But so much of this hype, it started off as marketing and organically, just through social media and people talking. It didn't become about these movies versus one another. It became about combining and going to see both of them. And I love that. And no studio came up with that marketing plan. That was all word of mouth and people running with the memes and everything. This is what you want. This is the kind of thing that you want, especially if you're making movies that excite people. So this was a very exciting weekend for me, not just because I loved Oppenheimer and I liked Barbie and loved parts of that movie, but because it really did prove to me, and I am first and foremost a lover of movies, that enthusiasm is still out there. You just have to make the movies that are worthy of people going out to see them. And let's be honest, even the movies I liked this summer, very few of them, Across the Spider-Verse being one of them, were worth this kind of enthusiasm. So it's great to see. Let's get to the rest of the top 10 before we talk about Barbenheimer some more. There was a furious race here between Sound of Freedom and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 as to what the third place film of the weekend would be. And by about $500,000, Sound of Freedom ends up taking third place, a 27.3% drop from last weekend, a domestic total of $124.4 million. And yes, there is still discussion, and I've seen plenty of people that are saying like, well, these people aren't really going to see it. They're buying these tickets out. But I've also seen, by the way, plenty of other discussion, if you want to talk about anecdotal evidence, of people that work in theaters, online Reddit posts and forums, etc., saying like, yeah, no, these screenings are packed. People are going to see this film. So the idea that nobody is going to see Sound of Freedom, well, there's just as much anecdotal evidence to prove that that's wrong as there is anecdotal evidence to prove that it's right. The whole pay it forward angle, I know, adds a little bit of opacity to this process, and I'm hoping that we get a little more clarity. But regardless of what you think of how it's making its money, it is making this money, and it is a movie, at least in some cases, that is drawing full theaters full of people, whether you like it or not. It is happening. So $19.8 million in third place for Sound of Freedom, $19.3 million for Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. And when we look at Mission Impossible, a 64.6% drop from last weekend. And keeping in mind that the number from last weekend was a little bit lower than it would have been because it opened on Wednesday. So imagine what the drop would have looked like if Mission Impossible had opened last Friday instead of last Wednesday. Hindsight is always 2020, but in wake of this, and again, nobody really knew how big this wave was going to break, but we did know, and I covered it here on the channel several weeks ago, we did know that Oppenheimer had a contractual agreement with IMAX to have all IMAX screens for 3 weeks. We knew that that was going to happen. Mission Impossible knew a matter of weeks ago that they would only have about 10 days to be in IMAX screens. Those tickets cost more, which means that that adds to the gross more. And also keep in mind, it's not just IMAX. Mission Impossible lost a lot of the premium large format screens other than IMAX, your Dolby screens, etc., to Barbie and Oppenheimer. So it was already really kind of walking wounded from a lower than anticipated opening last weekend. And the thing that everybody kept saying is like, well, don't worry, this is a leggy franchise. You know, it'll make its money back over time. Well, it got absolutely wiped off the map by Barbie and Oppenheimer this weekend. And, you know, I think looking at it now, the smart thing would have been to push the release date. And I know that Tom Cruise was hoping he can maybe convince one or both of these movies to move or try to figure out something with the screens. But when it looked like that wasn't going to happen, I know it might have been a bit of an ego blow, but this movie, Mission Impossible, had no business opening where it did before these two big movies. And the word of mouth has been building. It's not like this came out of nowhere. The word of mouth has been building even more over the last few weeks. Not just one big movie, but two big movies and losing the premium screens. I think it would have been smart to move this thing to mid-August, maybe even move it to Christmas, where you could really have that whole season, because unless audiences loop back to go see Mission Impossible, then it's going to be in real trouble here domestically. Because yes, this is a franchise that doesn't necessarily pop when it opens, but at the same time, if it doesn't have that legginess to back up a lower opening, then it's going to have some real trouble, especially with a high budget. So I'm sure there's a lot of second guessing that is being done and that I'm doing right here on the show, but it looks like a tactical mistake for them to put Mission Impossible where it was on the release calendar. Keeping in mind also that originally The Marvels was supposed to open this weekend, July 28th, and back in February, Disney pushed it to later in the year, but then also pulled Haunted Mansion up to this weekend, and I think Haunted Mansion is going to get absolutely obliterated by these two movies, so I don't exactly know why they pulled Haunted Mansion up earlier in the schedule from its August release date. Doesn't make any sense for it to be coming out in July anyway, but whatever. So a lot of very questionable decisions, but also sometimes you just happen to be in the way of these things, and there's nothing that you can really do about it. A bit of an unforced error, though, I think, for Paramount and Tom Cruise and company with this film. In fifth place was Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in its fourth week of release, with a 45.6% drop from last weekend, a $6.6 million weekend total, and a domestic total of $158.9 million. In sixth place was Insidious: The Red Door, dropping 49% in its third week. Its domestic total is now up to $71.1 million. Elemental continues to hold well. Keep in mind that its opening weekend mate, The Flash, has long been out of the top 10. 37.1% drop from last weekend, a $5.7 million total, and a domestic total of $137.1 million. If it keeps hanging around, then it could probably get over $150 million domestic, which would help Pixar and Disney save face in the face of that low opening for Elemental. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse spends an eighth week in the top 10, a total of $2.8 million, and a domestic total of $375.2 million. It's currently the number one movie of the summer, but I have a suspicion that it may not hold that title for much longer. Transformers: Rise of the Beasts dropped 66.8% in its seventh week for a $1.1 million total, and a domestic total of just over $155 million. And No Hard Feelings stays in the top 10 at just over $1 million, and it is close to broaching the $50 million total domestically. Dropping out of the top 10 this week, The Little Mermaid, after 8 weeks, drops out, as does Joyride after just 2 weeks. And why did Joyride drop out of the top 10? Well, it may be because of this chart. It's a new one here. The most theaters lost. Which movie shed the most theaters from last weekend? And it was actually Joyride. This movie was wiped out of theaters. It lost 2,485 theaters. It's only playing in 335 theaters still domestically, which is less than Ruby Gillman Gilman Teenage Kraken. So this movie was just swept out. There is no chance for it to hang around and find its audience in theatrical release. If it's going to be a hit, it's going to be a word-of-mouth streaming and digital hit. Ruby Gilman Teenage Kraken lost the second most theaters. It lost 1,259. It remains in 502 theaters. Transformers Rise of the Beast lost 1,207 theaters. It's still playing in 834 theaters. No Hard Feelings lost about half of its remaining theaters, 1,036 theaters. It's the only one of these movies that's still technically in wide release, 1,017 theaters remaining. And The Little Mermaid probably dropped out of the top 10 as well because it lost 995 of its remaining theaters, with 620 theaters still remaining. And this is because they had to clear out room for Oppenheimer and for Barbie. You're not going to see this large number, 1,000 plus theaters lost for multiple movies every single week. But when you have this big combination release, then there are some movies that are just going to get pushed out because those theater owners want to play, especially Barbie and Oppenheimer, on every possible screen. And there was talk that Oppenheimer may even have made several million more this weekend because people went to see Barbie and it was sold out. And that's why I think the weekday numbers for Barbie and Oppenheimer are going to be good, because I think there's a large number of people that tried to go see the movie on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday that aren't going to be able to see it until today or tomorrow or this upcoming weekend. I think Barbie in particular is probably going to have pretty good legs, and I'm curious also to see what's going to happen with Oppenheimer. I think the fact that people wanted to go see it in the premium formats and maybe couldn't get seats means that it's also going to hold well in its second weekend and beyond. So we talked about just how much money Barbie and Oppenheimer made this weekend, and it made so much that I actually had to go back and remake one of my charts. It's that road to recovery chart where I show you where we were this weekend versus the average weekend for 2021 and 2022, and then the average weekend for 2015 through 2019. So this is what the chart looked like last week when we looked at it, and you'll see that the top most number on this chart was $250 million, because no weekend since 2015 had ever had an average box office total of over $250 million. Well, that ends today, because look at the chart now. I had to up the top limit to $325 million because the combined box office for all movies led by Oppenheimer and Barbie was at about $310 million this past weekend. And when you see that dotted black line, look how far above the average, both for 2021 and 2022 and 2015 to 2019, this past weekend was. It's over $100 million over the average for this weekend pre-pandemic. 2015 through 2019, the top performing movie for that era was the opening of The Lion King. 2021 and 2022 was the opening of Nope, which came out this time last year. Yeah, that is just how many people went to the movies this weekend. We are well beyond the average box office for any time in recent history. And when you look at the domestic box office by the combined gross of all movies, this was actually the fourth best weekend unadjusted for inflation in the history of the domestic box office. The fifth best weekend by the combined gross of all movies was December 20th through the 27th, 2015. That was led by the second weekend of The Force Awakens, as well as the opening of Daddy's Home and David O. Russell's film Joy. Then we had this last weekend. The total box office was at $311.2 million, led by Barbie, Oppenheimer, and Sound of Freedom. Then we have December 18th through the 20th, 2015. That's the weekend that Star Wars The Force Awakens debuted. That was the lion's share of the box office. Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Road Chip, and Sisters also debuted that week. Then in second place with $313.9 million total box office was April 27th to the 29th, 2018. That was again largely the opening of Avengers Infinity War. A Quiet Place was still continuing its run in second place, and I Feel Pretty came in third place. And then the highest grossing weekend in box office history domestically was April 26th to the 28th, 2019. Over $400 million total for all movies. But again, the majority of that was Avengers Endgame, which opened that weekend. Captain Marvel was in second place. The Curse of La Llorona was in third place. But really, when you look at these 5 weekends, this past weekend was the only one that wasn't absolutely dominated by one movie. Barbie was, of course, a big chunk of that $311.2 million combined gross at the domestic box office this weekend, but Oppenheimer was also a really, really big piece of the puzzle, bigger than any second place movie that we've ever seen in that position. And when we look at 3-day opening weekends domestically, Barbie is the top opening weekend weekend of the year at $162 million. That bumps the Super Mario Bros. Movie to second place, although keep in mind that that movie opened on a Wednesday. Had it opened on a Friday, it's likely that it would still have the top opening gross of the year, but that's not how it works. We count Friday through Sunday as the opening weekend. $146.3 million for the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse now in third place with $120.6 million. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 in fourth place with $118.4 million. And Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania at $106.1 million. Looking outside the domestic marketplace to all countries outside of the US and Canada, Barbenheimer was also the dominant cinematic force. Barbie opened to $194.3 million in all territories outside the domestic marketplace, and Oppenheimer almost cracked the century mark. It opened to $98 million internationally. That bumped Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 down to third place with $55 million. In fourth place was the Chinese film Creation of the Gods 1, Kingdom of Storms. This movie was filmed back in 2018. This Part 1 was supposed to come out in 2020. Then, of course, the pandemic happened, so there will be more films in this series to follow. And in fifth place is the animated film 30,000 Miles from Chang'an at $40.3 million. So when you take those international numbers, you add it to the domestic gross, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and Barbie absolutely crushed it around the globe. $356.3 million in just its opening weekend. That is a record for 2023. We'll look at those numbers in just a moment. Oppenheimer opens to $180.4 million worldwide. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning dropped 64.5%, so its fortunes were not any better worldwide than they were domestically at $74.3 million. Creation of the Gods 1, Kingdom of Storms is still at number 4, and 30,000 Miles from Chang'an is at number 5. And looking at those 3-day opening weekends worldwide for this year, I don't know if I would have, it's not saying I don't have faith in Barbie, but would I have said it would have opened bigger than Fast and the Furious and 2 big MCU films? Not necessarily, but yeah, $356.3 million. That bumps the Super Mario Bros. Movie down to second place. It opened to $319.1 million worldwide. Fast X at $318.4 million is now in third place. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is in fourth place, and Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania now in fifth place. And looking at the summer box office domestically, the top 3 for now remain the same, but I think we're going to start bumping these movies down the chart very soon. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, number 1, it's cracked the $375 million mark domestically. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is at number 2. The Little Mermaid is at number 3 as it approaches $300 million domestically. Barbie enters the chart at number 4, which means in 3 days, it made more than every other movie released this summer. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny cracks the top 5 with $158.9 million. Transformers Rise of the Beast drops 2 spots to number 6. Fast X drops 2 spots to number 7. Elemental drops 1 spot to number 8. Sound of Freedom stays at number 9, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 stays at number 10. But we have our first big dropout for the summer season, which is that The Flash is now out of the summer movie box office top 10. And when we look at my predictions, that means my first prediction has now been eliminated. I picked The Flash as the 4th highest grossing movie of the summer. Boy, was I wrong. And I picked Barbie at number 10. And let me defend myself here very quickly, because I said I was picking Barbie in case it blew up, and I didn't want to look stupid for not putting it on my summer list. And that's because when I made this choice, we had no trailers for Barbie. I think there was 1 teaser. We just knew that Greta Gerwig had directed a Barbie movie that she had co-written with Noah Baumbach. That's it. Nothing about the plot, nothing. And nobody knew what to make of this. It was still in the time when we were talking about Barbie versus Oppenheimer. So I will defend putting Barbie to number 10. I know people are going to say that that was a dumb thing to do. Well, it was April. I did, by the way, put Oppenheimer in my top 10, which a lot of people said was a stupid thing to do, but people tend to fixate on the things that they think are dumb and not maybe some of the moves that I think may have been a little savvy. But yeah, The Flash now eliminated from the race, so the best that I'm going to do is 9 out of 10, and I think that there's a couple of mine that are still vulnerable, especially if a movie like Ninja Turtles ends up doing really well in August, or Blue Beetle explodes for some reason, or who knows, maybe the Haunted Mansion is going to catch fire. I don't know, maybe someone will make a TikTok or a meme about it and it'll go through the roof. Who knows? Looking at the race for the number 1 summer movie domestically, Barbie's the pink line there, and you can see it has an easy lead over Across the Spider-Verse, so if it is going to fall behind the pace of Across the Spider-Verse, then it's really going to have to take a big drop during the week and going into weeks 2 and 3 at the box office. And given the response to the movie historically, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. So I think it is very likely that Barbie is going to wind up being the #1 movie this summer, and it may not be especially close if this movie has the kind of legs. If it can do 2.5 to 3 times its opening weekend, then it's really going to be quite a blockbuster, whether it's in the summer or outside of the summer. So these other lines may be completely superfluous in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So let's break down specifically some of the records that both Barbie and Oppenheimer set this weekend. I mentioned that Barbie was the #1 opening weekend domestically and worldwide for 2023. It's also the 3rd biggest opening in the history of Warner Brothers, unadjusted for inflation. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 still holds the record from back in 2011 at $169.1 million, followed by Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice at $166 million. Then Barbie, now in 3rd place, just ahead of, Christopher Nolan. He had a tough job coming in behind Barbie, both historically and at the box office. The Dark Knight Rises is now bumped down to #4 at $160.8 million, and The Dark Knight bumped down to #5 at $158.4 million. Looking at the best opening weekends of the decade, Spider-Man No Way Home still the best back in December of 2021 at $260.1 million, followed by Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness at $187.4 million last May. Then we have Black Panther: Wakanda Forever last November at $181.3 million. Barbie posting the 4th best opening weekend of the 2020s at $162 million, with the Super Mario Bros. Movie now going down to 5th place. And when we talk about openings for films directed or co-directed by women, Barbie has set the record here as well. #1 with $162 million. That bumps Captain Marvel, which was co-directed by Anna Boden at $153.4 million. Frozen 2, which was co-directed by Jennifer Buck, is at $130.2 million. Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman, which is the only other film on this list that was directed by a solo female director, is in 4th place at $103.2 million. And then we have The Matrix Reloaded from back in 2003 at $91.7 million. Now, I know some people might take issue with The Matrix Reloaded being there because the Wachowskis at that time were not publicly identifying as women, and some people have said that the market reacts differently based on that information. So if you were going to make this a list of the top 5 films directed by women who were publicly identifying as women at the time of release, then Sam Taylor Johnson's 50 Shades of Grey would be the 5th place movie on the list. She's currently in 6th place at $85.1 million. Looking at where Oppenheimer falls for Christopher Nolan, it's not in bad company. His top opening film all time is The Dark Knight Rises at $160.8 million, followed by The Dark Knight at $158.4 million. Then Oppenheimer in 3rd place at $82.4 million. Inception in 4th place at $62.7 million. And Dunkirk in 5th place at $50.5 million. The interesting thing about Nolan, he obviously loves this particular weekend in July, because look at these movies. Every single one of them has opened on that same week in July. Hey, he's had some great luck this weekend, so I get it, and he can pretty much release his movies whenever he wants. He's got say on that, unless there's a, world-altering pandemic or something. When you adjust Christopher Nolan's movies for inflation, Oppenheimer still holds pretty well. The Dark Knight flip-flops with The Dark Knight Rises to become the #1 opener, adjusted for inflation, at $224.4 million, with The Dark Knight Rises at $213.8 million. Then Inception moves up to 3rd place at $87.8 million, but Oppenheimer's just behind at $82.4 million, with Batman Begins taking that 5th spot back in 2005 at $76.1 million. So I mentioned earlier that Barbie and Oppenheimer were a historic duo as far as movies opening in 1st place and in 2nd place. And this was actually the best kind of co-debut in box office history when you look at a movie that opened at $100+ million and the other movies that debuted that same week. And this is really kind of successful counter-programming. These are the biggest debuts of all time alongside movies that opened to $100 million or more. So here we see Barbie opening at $162 million. Oppenheimer opened at $82 million, and that is easily the best performance for another film debuting alongside one of these huge $100+ million blockbuster openings. The next best performance was Central Intelligence back in 2016. Finding Dory opened to $135 million. That same week, Central Intelligence debuted to $35.5 million. So that's a respectable performance, but obviously the gap much, much bigger. The third best performance was The Blind Side, which opened to $34.1 million against Twilight New Moon at $142.8 million. Strangely enough, Christopher Nolan has done this before, but he was on the other side of it. When The Dark Knight opened back in 2008 to $158.4 million, Mamma Mia was also able to have a respectable opening at $27.7 million, and many people said that it was counter-programming the other way from what we saw this weekend. And in fifth place is Captain Underpants, the first epic movie. Wonder Woman opened to $103.2 million back in June of 2017, and Captain Underpants was able to muster $23.8 million. And really, people use this word counter-programming a lot to just mean that two different movies are coming out. But Barbie and Oppenheimer did truly seem to exemplify what the goal is of actual counter-programming. Because I want to look at the demographics. These were the demographics that were shared of the Thursday night preview. So these were the audiences that were the first to come out and see Barbie and Oppenheimer. Barbie's numbers are in pink, Oppenheimer's are there in black. Let's look at these splits here. Barbie's audience on the Thursday preview night was 71% women versus 35% men. Oppenheimer's audience on Thursday preview night was 65% men and 29% women. So those demographics almost completely switch between men and women. When you look at the strongest demographic for Barbie, 41% were women under 25. That was the weakest demographic for Oppenheimer. Only 16% of Oppenheimer's audience was women under 25. But when you look at the strongest demographic for Oppenheimer, men over 25, that was 40% of the preview night audience. That was the weakest demographic for Barbie. Only 14% of Barbie's audience was men over 25. So when you're looking at trying to counter-program something, this is textbook what you're trying to do. You're basically trying to see if you can get one audience to turn out for one movie and a completely different audience to turn out for a different one. Yes, of course, there is some overlap, but really what we're seeing is that wherever one of these movies didn't perform great in a demographic, the other one filled in those gaps. That is perfectly executed. So the opening weekend numbers for both of these movies were strong, not just because of their box office performance, but because of their budget. This summer, we've talked so many times about movies that would have had a decent performance, except they were made for like $400 million or some crazy number. That wasn't the case with either of these films. So as we've been doing with other movies this summer, let's take a look at the profit breakdown and keep in mind that these are just market estimates and also that this is just ticket sales. This isn't any kind of ancillaries or, marketing tie-ins, anything like this. This is purely money that's coming in from the ticket sales internationally and domestically. And the goal here, if you're a studio, is to break even. And if you can make a profit in that theatrical window, that's great. So let's look first at Barbie. A budget reported at $145 million. A prints and advertising budget at $150 million. And if you saw the marketing for Barbie, I think that's pretty easy to believe that they spent just as much promoting the movie as they did making the movie. That puts the total costs at $295 million. So definitely a risk, but not a $400 million risk. And let's look at how it's doing so far. $8.2 million from the Chinese market. There's word that the movie may be picking up a little bit of momentum there, but currently bringing in $1.8 million back to investors. $186.1 million from the rest of the world. That returns $74.4 million so far. A 60% share of domestic week one, which we are not through yet. This is just the first 3 days, and already $97.2 million coming back to investors based off of a 60% share being taken from the theatrical gross. The gross currently is at $356.3 million. I estimate a net of $173.4 million against costs of $295 million. That currently puts Barbie at about $121.5 million away from turning a profit in the theatrical window, keeping in mind that this movie shows no signs of stopping. So it could easily come close to double this gross, maybe, by this time next week, certainly in the next 10 to 14 days, which means that I think there's a very high degree of likelihood that this movie is going to be profitable in the theatrical window, and perhaps very profitable. And then keep in mind, on top of that profit comes all of the different marketing tie-ins, and there were a lot of those for Barbie. This movie has the potential to make a lot of money for Warner Brothers, maybe even enough money to offset the ruinous costs of The Flash, which lost them hundreds of millions of dollars. Taking a look at Oppenheimer, which keep in mind, Christopher Nolan left Warner Brothers after they dumped all of their movies on HBO Max back in 2021. So this maybe could have been a Warner Brothers movie in a different universe. It has a budget reportedly of $100 million. According to multiple sources, Christopher Nolan negotiated that Universal would also spend $100 million promoting the film. So we're going to put costs at $200 million for the movie. It does not have a release date in China. I don't know if it's going to get released in China. So currently nothing coming back from that market. $98 million internationally. That brings back $39.2 million to the investors. A 60% share of its $82.4 million gross thus far domestically is at $49.4 million. So when we look at the gross revenue currently worldwide, it's at $180.4 million. I estimate a net of $88.6 million versus costs of $200 million. But you'll see another line there that says Nolan. And that's because, and again, this is according to multiple reports, when Christopher Nolan was shopping Oppenheimer to different studios, of course, most of those studios would give him just about anything that he wanted because they wanted the next Chris Nolan movie. And the thing that he reportedly got from Universal was 20% of the first dollar gross. And what first dollar gross means is 20% of the money that comes in before anybody takes their cut. Now, I was trying to research and see if that was before theaters even took their cut out of the revenue. And from what I could find, what I could research, first dollar gross means exactly that. Whatever number we see as the gross of the movie, that's the percentage that Christopher Nolan gets. And I know that seems like a lot of money, but he's one of the few directors that is in a position to demand that kind of revenue. So while this may seem like a high number, and I will adjust this figure if I hear differently, currently I have 20% of the gross revenue going to Christopher Nolan, which right now is $36 million. That also means that Oppenheimer needs to clear a little bit of extra real estate in order to make a profit in the theatrical window. But still, right now, I estimate that it needs about $147.4 million more of net revenue in order to turn a profit theatrically. And even with that extra 20% going to Nolan, it's still in a better position after 3 days than the majority of the big summer blockbuster movies that have come out this year. So this says a lot about Barbie and a lot about Oppenheimer, that after 3 days, they are in a much more stable financial position than Indiana Jones and Transformers movies and Disney remakes. That's pretty impressive. Speaking of Indiana Jones, I wanted to give an update on a couple of the other movies that are in current release, because there are, believe it or not, a few other ones. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is taking whatever small victories it can. It has passed the worldwide gross of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Keep in mind that these are not adjusted for inflation figures, so, it's not that big of a win, but hey, it'll take the win. It's currently at $334.6 million worldwide. That means that Barbie made more than Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in its opening weekend than it has made worldwide throughout its entire run. I mentioned Pixar saving face, not just domestically, but also worldwide. The total worldwide gross of Elemental has now crossed $350 million, which means that it has outgrossed not just the pandemic-era films, but also 2015's The Good Dinosaur. It's looking to soon pass the totals for A Bug's Life, Toy Story, maybe even Cars 3, and then it would be tough to get up to that Cars level at $460 million. But this is also a movie that's done well, and it still has some markets where it can make up some of that revenue. So, Elemental, again, as I've said a few times this summer, it is still a financial disappointment in the sense of the budget numbers, but it certainly has not been as big of an embarrassment for Pixar as it seemed like it was going to be on its opening weekend. And, I even may have invested a little bit too heavily because I was just so shocked at how low that number was. But audiences around the world have been hanging around, have been giving this movie a chance. And if there is a silver lining, it may be that Elemental is perhaps the movie that had to fail at the box office, but sort of rehab their image and get people back on board in order for their next movies to pick up more momentum. We've seen that happen before. That might be the case with Elemental. Finally, looking at Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, it's starting to wrap up its domestic run, but it has passed the unadjusted gross of Spider-Man 2 to become the fourth highest grossing film in the Spider-Man universe. It's now only behind Spider-Man Far From Home, Tobey Maguire's original Spider-Man film, and Spider-Man No Way Home. And it will very shortly officially double the gross of the first film, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So this has been a really impressive theatrical run thus far. We've got a lot more box office to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by FirstLeaf, and summer is the best time of year to get together with friends and family, and there's so many different kinds of activities: days by the pool, dinner on the patio, or maybe just a nice chat indoors in the air conditioning. That's why summer's also the perfect time to join the FirstLeaf Wine Club. FirstLeaf is great because it's fully customizable, and that includes not just which wines you're getting, but when you get them, meaning that you can pick what day your wine delivery arrives at your door without stressing about missing a delivery. All you have to do is answer some simple questions on the FirstLeaf website about the wines that you like and the ones that you don't like, and a customized assortment of world-class wines based on your preferences will be shipped to you. Our tastes here tend to go a little bit towards sweeter wines, which isn't always what's recommended by our friends, so it's great to know that FirstLeaf is going to be sending us a selection based on our tastes, not what other people think we should be drinking. Your personalized wine shipments are delivered right to your door, so you can enjoy bottles that you'll love all summer long, all priced lower than what you'd pay at a wine store. Plus, every selection is backed by FirstLeaf's 100% satisfaction guarantee. To make sure you've got great wine whenever you want it this summer, you've got to try FirstLeaf. Just head over to tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell to sign up, and you'll get your first 6 hand-curated bottles for just $44.95. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell. That's tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell to get your first 6 bottles for under $8 a bottle. Tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell. Looking at some other weekend numbers, let's look at the per theater averages for this past weekend. Barbie brought in $38,186 per theater in each of its 4,243 theaters, and Oppenheimer brought in $22,841 theaters on average in each of its 3,610 theaters, which means that on average, if your theater is running both Oppenheimer and Barbie, you brought in $60,000 this weekend from those 2 movies alone. Some very happy theater owners out there this weekend. In third place is the documentary Have You Got It Yet? The Story of Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd, which is about the original frontman of the legendary rock group before their big success with albums like Dark Side of the Moon. It played in only 1 theater for $8,652. Sound of Freedom in fourth place brought in $6,035 in each of its 3,285 theaters. And then Theater Camp, which put up a big per theater average last weekend, expanded its release to 51 theaters for a $5,509 average per theater. And looking at the top per theater averages for the year, Theater Camp was added to this list last week, and now Barbie becomes the only wide release, supplanting the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Its $38,186 average is 5th best for the year, behind Theater Camp at $50,203, Past Lives at $58,067, Beau is Afraid at $80,099, and Asteroid City at $140,857. Of course, those movies all opening in 4 to 6 theaters instead of the 4,243 theaters that Barbie saw. Looking at the top films in limited release this past weekend, Theater Camp, even though it had a much smaller gross per theater than last weekend, still had the top gross in limited release, $280,981 in 51 theaters, followed by The Miracle Club, which is playing in 271 theaters and brought in $186,525. Past Lives still doing really well on the limited release circuit. In its 8th week, $166,360. Its domestic total has now passed $10 million. Terrifier, which is a movie that came out several years ago and had a sequel, Terrifier 2, that we talked about a lot on this show, actually had its widest release ever in re-release this past weekend in 400 theaters, bringing in $123,957. And in 5th place in an unknown number of theaters was the indie horror film Cobweb with $98,323. Now, these movies that we talk about in limited or specialty release are often found at the various independent theaters around the country, but that's not the case with this week's theater. You actually will rarely find new release movies, even ones like Barbie and Oppenheimer, playing at this theater. Instead, you will find some of the most classic films to ever grace the silver screen, and this is a theater that many people might be familiar with. It is the Paramount Theater in Austin, Texas, which is actually 2 theaters now located next to each other, the Paramount and the Stateside Theater. The original Paramount Theater was built in 1915 as a vaudeville theater, and in that era, acts including Harry Houdini and the Marx Brothers graced graced the stage. The theater was converted to show films in the 1930s and played host to some of the all-time classics of cinema, as well as in-person appearances from stars like Katharine Hepburn. As cinema attendance declined in the 60s and 70s, the Paramount seemed headed for destruction, but was saved in 1973 by three local businessmen who, along with the community, helped to fund the renovation of the theater, established it as a nonprofit, and restored the theater's ability to serve as a live act venue in addition to screening films. It merged with the next door State Theater in the 1990s and has become a local hub of culture and activity as Austin's star has risen in the film community. The Paramount is not generally, as I mentioned, a first-run theater, but instead is focused on film history and appreciation in addition to live musical acts. This week alone, the Paramount will host screenings of Sally Potter's 1992 film Orlando, Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Disney's Sleeping Beauty, and a horror double feature of classic Vincent Price films, House of Wax and Theater of Blood. This week we'll also see the culmination of one of the Paramount's 2-week summer theater programs, which features performances from the campers. And in addition to running all of these classic film series, the Paramount also teams with partner organizations to provide free tickets to use in programs related to the arts. It's great to see organizations like this, and especially movie theaters, that support kids going into the arts, and they want to educate kids about the festivals and give them resources and a place to do things. These spaces need to exist, and the Paramount seems like a great space. You can find out about the schedule for the Paramount Theater, buy tickets, and donate as well. It is a 501c3 organization at austintheater.org. And if you end up doing any of those things, as always, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Let's take a look now at some charts for the year overall. First of all, the domestic box office top 10. The top 5 remains the same. The Super Mario Bros. Movies at number 1, followed by Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, The Little Mermaid, and Ant-Man the Wasp Quantumania, although this is going to get shaken up real soon. In 6th place for right now is John Wick Chapter 4. Barbie enters the chart at number 7. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny climbs 2 spots to number 8. Creed 3 falls 2 spots to number 9. Transformers Rise of the Beasts falls 2 spots to number 10, and Fast X drops out of the domestic top 10 for the year. Looking at the top 10 worldwide for 2023, not much change on this chart just yet. Of course, the Super Mario Bros. Movie remains number 1. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse moves up 1 spot to number 4. It's approaching $700 million worldwide, but the rest of the chart remains the same. Barbie, however, should be breaking onto this top 10 very soon, and we'll see just how far it will go in the weeks to come. Before we take a look at the reviews for recent releases and the schedule for movies that are coming out this weekend, as always, I like to take a look back at a weekend in box office history, and we're going to go back 15 years to one of those successful quote-unquote counter-programming weekends, and it's hard to believe this was 15 years ago, July 18th through the 20th, 2008, which saw the debut of The Dark Knight, at that time, the best opening in domestic box office history at $158.4 million. Of course, it revolutionized the world of superhero films and comic book movies, gave us one of the best superhero movie performances of all time in Heath Ledger's Joker, which would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and also really revolutionized the Academy Awards when you think about it, because The Dark Knight's exclusion from the Best Picture race in 2009 was one of the reasons, the main reasons, that the Academy expanded the field of Best Picture nominees to include more than 5. In second place was Mamma Mia with $27.7 million. It was one of those summer movies that had great legs as it went throughout the summer and ended up with a really decent domestic and worldwide gross. It would go on to spawn a sequel a few years later. Hancock was in third place, another superhero film, in its third week of release with a $14 million weekend total and a $191.5 million domestic total. That was a very successful film domestically. We had back-to-back Best Actor winners here, actually. Will Smith in Hancock, and then Brendan Fraser in Journey to the Center of the Earth, which dropped 41.3% in its second week for a $12.3 million total and a domestic total of $43.5 million. And then maybe we'll make it a three-peat and Ron Perlman will win Best Actor this year, because in fifth place was Hellboy 2, The Golden Army. Ooh, a big drop though, 70.7% in its second week to $10.1 million for a domestic total of $56.5 million. Of course, I don't like to just leave those numbers 15 years ago in the past. I like to look at what they would look like in today's dollars. So let's hit that inflation button to see what those 2022 numbers would look like. The Dark Knight at number 1 with $224.4 million, followed by Mamma Mia with an adjusted total of $39.3 million. Hancock would have an adjusted total of $19.8 million for the weekend and $271.4 million domestically. Then Journey to the Center of the Earth was $17.4 million for the weekend and $61.6 million domestic. And Hellboy 2: The Golden Army at $14.3 million for the weekend and $80.1 million domestically. As we begin to wrap things up, there's been a feature I added to the show the last few weeks called Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, and I'm still tweaking. I added a little bit this week that I hope people like, where I look at the tomato meter score and the average critic's rating. So the tomato meter score is a binary score. It's fresh, rotten. Did the critic give it a good review or a bad review, which can kind of sometimes skew the positive or negative reaction of a critic. But I also compare it to the average critical rating, which is a number from 1 to 10, which tells you not just if a critic liked a movie, but how much they liked a movie. And I think that can be much more instructive when you're trying to figure out, well, which movies are critics really liking right now? So let's look at a selection of recent movies. First of all, looking at just the tomato meter, Netflix's The Outlaws, which has been putting up good streaming numbers, is still in the basement at a 22% rotten, meaning only 22% of critics gave it a fresh or positive review. Insidious: The Red Door also sitting at rotten, 38%. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny at 69% fresh. The Beanie Bubble, which is a new streaming movie on Apple TV Plus about the Beanie Baby craze, is currently sitting at 73% fresh. Sound of Freedom and Elemental both sitting at 74% fresh. Then Theater Camp at 84% fresh. Barbie at 90%. We didn't have Barbie reviews last week on the show. They Cloned Tyrone, which is on Netflix right now, is at 92% fresh. So right now it's above Barbie when you look at just the tomato meter score. Oppenheimer's at 94% fresh. And then tied for the top spot by tomato meter is Talk to Me, which is A24's new horror film opening this weekend at 96% fresh. And Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 also at 96% fresh. So if you're going just by the tomato meter, it looks like Talk to Me and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 are the two movies that critics like the most, except that's not actually what the average critical score says, which is that rating that all critics give from 1 to 10. And I've added sort of in gray here next to each of these critics' average ratings, the tomato meter score and also what I think the spread is. So for example, when we look at The Outlaws, it has on the right a tomato meter score of 22%, but an average critical rating of 3.9. So I give that spread at plus 17, which is basically that 3.9 would be a 39%. That's 17 points higher than its 22% rotten number. That means that critics still didn't like the movie, but they didn't like it 22% bad. Insidious: The Red Door has a 4.9 average critics rating, so it's still rotten. The Beanie Bubble, with its 73% fresh rating, actually only has a 6.3 average critical score, which means that the tomato meter may be a little deceptive as far as how much critics liked that movie. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is actually pretty close as far as its average rating and its tomato meter. It has a 69% tomato meter score and a 6.4 average rating. Critics are a little cooler on Elemental than the tomato meter might indicate, a 74% tomato meter score, but a 6.4 average score for Elemental. Sound of Freedom has a 6.6 average score and a 74% fresh rating, so that's pretty much in line. It's a single-digit difference. Theater Camp, as we talked about last week, has a 7.3 rating, but an 84% fresh. So critics seem to be a little bit higher when you look at just the tomato meter than they are by the average rating. But They Cloned Tyrone is really the biggest disparity as far as the tomato meter versus the average rating. It's at 92% fresh, but has a 7.4 average rating from critics, which puts it behind Oppenheimer, Barbie, Talk to Me, and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. And when you look at Dead Reckoning Part 1 and Talk to Me, those are both the top movies when you look at things just by tomato meter, but they also have an 8.0 critics' average score, which means that the tomato meter is a little deceptive as far as how much critics liked those films. If you want to know the two films on this list that critics liked the most, it would be Barbie with an average rating of 8.1 and Oppenheimer with an average rating of 8.7. Barbie has a tomato meter of 90%. Oppenheimer has a tomato meter of 94%. So what that tells me is that it was a little more polarizing than either Talk to Me or Dead Reckoning Part 1. But the critics that loved both films loved them more on average than they liked either of those other two films. So right now, if you're looking at this list, Oppenheimer would be the critics' favorite by average rating at an 8.7, followed by Barbie with an 8.1, then Talk to Me and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning at an 8.0. You're probably in pretty good shape if you choose to watch any of those films in theaters. And there are a lot of options when it comes to movies to watch in theaters, not just the Barbenheimer combo, but several movies that will be hitting theaters for the first time this weekend. Disney's Haunted Mansion, which currently does not have reviews, or at least as I'm taping this episode, will be hitting wide release this weekend. $160 million budget for this Disney movie. Yikes. As I mentioned, also A24's Talk to Me, which is a horror hit that's gotten great advance buzz, is hitting theaters. By the way, there are a lot of actors that have gotten waivers to continue filming and also to promote multiple A24 films because A24 is not a member of the AMPTP, the collection of studios and executives that the directors and writers are currently on strike against. So one of the few studios currently in production is A24, and that's because they agreed to the proposals currently on the table from the actors and writers for the AMPTP, and they have already agreed to abide by whatever the final agreement is between the actors, writers, and AMPTP. So good on A24 because they are full steam ahead. They are not stopped down on all of their projects like most other studios are. Just another reason to love them. Opening in many markets around the country is the anime film The First Slam Dunk. It was already a huge hit in Japan last year. It's a film about a high school basketball team, and it actually beat out Suzume, which is one of my favorite movies this year that came out here domestically, for the Japan Academy Film Prize for Best Animation, which is often referred to as Japan's equivalent of the Oscars or Academy Awards. Also opening in many markets is a movie called Sympathy for the Devil, starring Nicolas Cage as a guy who kidnaps Joel Kinnaman at gunpoint. I watched the trailer for this movie. It looks like he is going full Cage in this one. It is the year of full Nicolas Cage. Opening in limited release is a documentary called Kokomo City. It took the festival world by storm. It's a documentary about trans sex workers and their lives. I saw this virtually at the Sundance Film Festival. It is definitely an illuminating look into a life that very few people have experienced and could probably really even understand. Also opening in limited release is War Pony from directors Riley Keough and Gina Gamble, about two young Indigenous men and the decisions they make that change their lives. Lily Gladstone is already getting Oscar buzz for her role in Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, and she's starring in a movie that's opening in limited release this weekend called The Unknown Country. So if you want to get an early look at her talent, Marissa Maltz's road trip film might be up your alley. Also opening in limited release is a movie called The Beasts from director Rodrigo Sorogoyen. It's a thriller about ranchers who conflict with people who have lived on the land that they purchased. This movie won Best Film at the Goya Awards, Spain's equivalent of the Oscars, and also won Best Foreign Film at the César Awards, which is France's equivalent of the Oscars. So this could definitely be something worth checking out. And then also in limited release is a film called Never Say Never. We've mentioned this film on the charts from China for several weeks now. It is now getting a US release about a fighter who trains a group of scrappy young upstarts. And that does it for a jam-packed episode of Charts. I will be back, of course, next week to talk about Barbenheimer Week 2, as well as the new films that open, Haunted Mansion, and everything else. And also stay tuned right here on the channel because I always have reviews of upcoming films, movie news. I'm working on a second strike episode because we know a lot more about the actors' proposals as well as studios that have been given waivers to continue work. So I'm going to try to get an update video about the strike this week, as well as anything else that might pop up. Thanks so much for watching here on the channel. Be sure to check out the description below for information about our sponsor, as well as for information about the Paramount Theater in Austin, Texas. And as always, thanks for spending part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.